Okay, in this lesson, we're going to look at writing and solving equations that involve congruent angles. We already talked about writing equations of supplementary angles, and so now we're adding in congruent angles. So first of all, I want to remind you that the word congruent means that the angles are equal. Okay? And if you look in your notes at all your angles, examples of angles, there are about 4 types of congruent angles. Number 1, we have vertical angles that are congruent. Remember, vertical angles, angle 1 and angle 2 would be example of vertical angles because they're opposite the vertex from one another. These 2 angles would also be vertical angles. We also have corresponding angles that are congruent. Corresponding angles, remember, are in the same position but on different parallel lines. So one example would be maybe this angle number 2 and this angle number 4. They're both on top of their parallel line and on the right side of the transversal. So they're in the same position on their parallel line. Lots of different combinations of corresponding angles. Those are just one example. Another example of congruent angles are the alternate angles. And y'all are getting pretty good at that. Our alternate interior angles are congruent and our alternate exterior. Remember, at any point, if you need to pause the video to write something down or rewind it to hear it again, do that. So when we have our parallel lines, remember, alternate means they have to be diagonal from one another. And then interior, exterior means between the parallel lines for interior or outside the parallel lines for exterior. So all those types of angles are examples of congruent angles. So when we go to set up these problems, we're going to write an equation setting the 2 angles equal to one another. That's the key thing. The 2 angles are going to be equal to one another. We're going to solve the equation just like we learned with variables on both sides using Don't Call Me After Midnight. Then we're going to find the angle measure by plugging the value for x back into the angle measure. So we're not just solving for x. Sometimes we will, but I actually want to know what is the angle measure. Remember, they're congruent, so they should be the same. Okay, in the first example, I have 2 angles. Now let's just double check. I've told you we're only working on congruent angles, but let's just make sure and identify. So if you look at these 2 angles right here, notice they're both below their parallel line. So they're in the same position, which makes that which type of angles? Okay, hopefully you were thinking corresponding. So the angle relationship of these 2 angles is that they are corresponding angles. Okay? So now we're going to write our equation. It says to set the 2 angles equal to one another. Okay? Well, one angle is 23x minus 5 equals our second angle, 21x plus 5. We said they were congruent, so that means those 2 angles are equal. So I have just stated with my equation that those 2 angles are equal. And so now we're going to solve our equation. So we're going to check for like terms. None, check, done. Okay, now we're going to move our variables to the same side. I want to move the 21x. It's positive, so I'm going to subtract it. Remember, we move the variables by adding or subtracting. That leaves me with 2x minus 5 equals 5. Okay, Now we add or subtract our constant, which is -5. The inverse operation would be to add 5. Okay, that leaves me with 2x equals 10. And so now my last step, multiply or divide. So in this case, we're going to divide. And we get x equals 5. Now I solved the equation. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes that's all we have to do. But I want us to do the next step and find the angle measure. And so step 3 here tells us plug the value of x back into the angle measure. So they should be the same, right? So technically we should be able to just pick one. 23x minus 5, remember, means 23 times x minus 5. So I'm going to plug in the 5 right here. 23 times 5 minus 5. Remember, you can use your calculator for this. You don't have to use your own brain, and we don't want to miss something because we're not using our calculator. So I'm going to type in 23 times 5 minus 5. And remember, make sure you're using the minus button. And we get 110 degrees. So because these angles are congruent, they both should be 110 degrees. Let's just double check. If I plug in 5 right here, 21 times 5 plus 5, just double checking with my calculator, is also 110. Okay, so check, I'm done. Okay, let's look at the second example together. So the first thing I want us to determine is what kind of angle relationship do they have? What kind of angles are they? I want you to notice that this is inside the parallel line. So those are not interior angles. They are exterior angles. I hope that you're thinking a little bit ahead of me. Notice they are diagonal from one another. So they are alternating. So these would be an example of alternate exterior angles, but they're still congruent. That's one of the pairs that we wrote down. Okay, so now we're going to write an equation showing that the two angles are equal. So one of the angles is -1 plus 14x equals the other angle, which is 12x plus 17. Now I want to point out, if you had your equation flip-flopped, you could do that. It doesn't matter which angle you write on which side, just as long as you put the two angles equal to one another. Okay, so now we're going to go through our solving process. We don't need to distribute. We don't have any like terms. So now let's get our variables on the same side. I'm going to move the 12x to the other side by subtracting it. Okay, and let's write what we have left. We've got the -1. 14x minus 12x is 2x equals 17. Then I'm going to add 1 to both sides, moving my constant by adding or subtracting. That gives me 2x equals 18. Divide by 2, and we get x equals 9. Sometimes all they want to know is the value of x, but I want us to go a step further and find out what our angles are. So if I know x is 9, I'm going to come over here, and wherever I see an x, I'm going to plug in a 9. Remember, this means 14 times x. So let's check that with our calculator. You don't have to use your own brain. Great if you do. That wouldn't be wrong if you did, but just know that you don't have to. Okay, so I have the same problems from last time in there. So this time we have to type in a -1. Remember, your negative sign key is right here. So I'm going to type in -1 plus 14 times 9. and I get 125. Did you get 125? Make sure you can get that with your calculator. So this is 125 degrees. If they're congruent, that means they both should be 125 degrees, right? So let's just double check ourselves. If I plug in a 9 for the other angle, and I do 12 times 9 plus 17, I also get 125. So bam, I got it. My angle measures are both 125 degrees. If you would take your notes and glue those into your notebook and then work through the rest of the module.